Hello, everyone, and very welcome back to all of you for yet another exciting session that we have lined up for all of you. Let us now move on to our next session, which is a fireside chat on the topic blockchain, the journey to production grade scale. And for the same, I would like to welcome Mr. Sarang Boyer, in charge blockchain, National Payments Corporation of India, in conversation with Mr. Richard G. Brown, CTO, Recorda LLP. I would like to welcome both of you, and I would now request Mr. Sarang to please take over. Thank you.
Thanks, Garima. So hello there, and thanks for being part of this Global FinTech Festival 2020, and welcome to this interesting fireside chat with a very knowledgeable man in the field of technology, specifically the blockchain. We have with us Mr. Richard Brown. He is a CTO of R3, who are the makers of Coda DLT platform. He's a seasoned technical specialist in the BFSI industry. Nowadays, everybody is talking about blockchain. But when Richard talks about it, I would strongly recommend that you drop all the work and get yourself enlightened about this phenomena that is happening around us. So welcome, Richard, and thanks for joining in.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I feel pressured now to meet the expectations you've set.
Good. So all this phenomena, this started more than a decade back when the Bitcoin came into our world. But the underlying technology, which we call blockchain, it caught the fancy of this enterprise and technologies probably in the last 6-7 years. Since then, we have seen many POCs, pilots on blockchain in many industries, and BFSI in particular. And we have been hearing about these POCs so much that now people are getting bored. So, Richard, my question is, what do you think? When are we going to see the firework? And I don't mean the cricket match firework, the Labor Day firework.
It's a fair question, and I guess there's a lot packed into that question, and it's a good one to start with. So I guess at first I should say that contrary to perhaps public perception, there actually are several large-scale production implementations live as we speak. Some on the platform that I helped design and that R3 maintains Corda, but on other platforms as well, Hyperledger Fabric and other ones. If I look at the projects I'm familiar with, we can look down in Italy. There is a large project there called Spunter, which is deployed between most, not all yet, but most of the banks in Italy to automate the checking and reconciliation of balances between all the branches and all the institutions. It's a live production scale implementation of Corda. We have startups using it. There's gold being traded on the Corda blockchain in North America. And then admittedly at a smaller scale, things like HQLAX for balance sheet optimization and collateral management and things like the Marco Polo network and for trade finance. But I think your question is fair. There are some bright large success stories, but there are also lots more projects that are in the process of going live or are not there yet. I think there's a few things to say, and I'd be interested to see whether you agree, whether you disagree with me. One thing you can say is, and you began with Bitcoin. I think people forget the Bitcoin design. The original email about Bitcoin, I think that was circulated on a mailing list in 2008, and the Bitcoin network went live in 2009. And it's now 2020, so 11 or 12 years later, depending on how you measure it. And it was only this week that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in the United States gave banks permission to engage with it and other cryptocurrencies and from a custody perspective. So that's 12 years. The enterprise blockchain space has only really been going for 4 or 5. So although it seems a long time, it's actually half the time of some of the other the public block the permissionless blockchains. But I know that may sound like an excuse. So that's not really my argument, but it is a comparison. There's also then maybe my final point, and I'd love to see what you think about it, which is enterprise blockchain it involves entire markets, entire industries working together. It's not something that one firm can deploy and install. It's something that all participants in a market do. And that requires a lot of collaboration. It requires a lot of coordination. But of course, the prize when you get it right, it's so much bigger because you're transforming a whole market. So of course, I'm optimistic and urgent. I always want things to go faster, but I'm also pretty happy with where we are.
Perfectly agree on that one. But probably there's so much hype that was created in the beginning that people thought that it's going to appear the next day. So probably that's why even this normal delay in adoption of a very new technology seems quite long to people, right? So if I ask you, what do you think are the top 3 obstacles in the way of this production scale implementations of this technology?
So I think there's probably a few. So you asked for the top 3. So the first one, and I think this may explain the you talked about proofs of concept, is first of all there has to be a really strong business case, and that kind of seems obvious. It kind of seems almost like a cliche to say it. But in the early days, people don't quite know what the technology is good for. They're not quite sure where it fits. So there are often, and I think this is true for any new technology. There are always lots of experiments, and it's necessary because that's the learning process. And lots of those experiments, they fail because it turns out they were not good fits or there wasn't a business case. And I think it's taken people a while to realize that the business case, the reason for doing it is all about trying to transform or optimize entire markets. How can we improve how an entire market operates? So there's an understanding piece and a business case piece. You can never get away from the commercials. There's also the fact that it's difficult to get firms to collaborate. When you're trying to take the example in Italy, there's lots of different banks. They're competitors. And yet they're working together. So the lesson there was that was facilitated by the Italian Banking Association. There's an industry group that could see a real problem to be solved. The business case was there. And then they were able to drive that change. But there has to be a common reason for doing it. It can't just be because people they think it's the right thing to do. It either has to be pushed, for example, by a regulator, or because there's a win-win for everybody. Everybody's doing it for their own mercenary, profit-driven gains. You do this to make more money for your shareholders, and we have to. This is not a charity. It's not charity. So there has to be a business case. There has to be the right incentives for collaboration. And then the other thing, of course, is the technology is complex. We're trying to integrate different systems in different firms. You have to worry about the security, the cryptography. There are so many people in these firms whose job is to protect their institution from bad things happening. And then a blockchain firm like ours goes in and says, right, we're going to connect your core banking system across the internet to somebody else's core banking system. They get really scared. They can see the benefits, they can see the upside. But those people in the IT department, it's their job to protect against the downside. They get fired if bad things happen. So they have to be really sure this is the right thing to do. And so we have to spend a lot of time with them, showing them and helping them understand how the technology works. And that's an education thing, and it takes time. But once you're through that, the door is then open.
Great point. Yeah, and I think as we are going and we are seeing the evolution of this one, the governance and the regulations around this technology is probably something that if we address, we would see a much faster adoption rate. And also you made very good point about is there a business case, right? So I had heard this interesting view about blockchain where this person said, see, blockchain is like a religion. Okay, most of the people don't understand it, but they prescribe it as a solution to all the problems in the world, right? And my personal favorite, which is by me itself, right? So blockchain is not an aqua regia that is going to resolve all your problems. So we need to really understand where it fit in. Like the Bitcoin was created for a specific purpose. So exactly, you pointed out that if there is no value in doing it, it is not going to go a very long way. But we are seeing this maturity coming in. So only serious players going ahead, right?
Oh, you're totally right. I mean, you talk about sort of like magical thinking or aphoregia and things. We spent. I should take a step back. I feel immensely fortunate and privileged in my position because I'm CTO of an enterprise blockchain firm with our open source platform that people are building on. But we began as a collaboration of initially lots of banks, where we had the space to ask ourselves, do we think this technology has any relevance to financial services? That's where we began. Just because people say it, it doesn't mean it's true. So let's actually find out for ourselves. Let's convince ourselves what unique problem we think this technology can solve, and then ask ourselves, is that a valuable problem? And if it is, then how do we tweak the technology? Or in our case, can we build a new platform that works appropriately to go fix those problems? And you're right, it's not magic, it's just computer software. And the insight, if you like, that we were privileged to be able to spend the time to discover was, for me, this is all about the problem it solves is if you have two or more parties or two or more distinct institutions, two banks, two insurance companies, a buyer and a seller, whatever it is, two or more of them, who should be in consensus about some data, a purchase order, the buyer and the seller should both have the same copy of it. A lender and a borrower should both know what the loan agreement is. You've got two or more parties who should be in sync. So often they're not. They've got different systems, different understanding, different copies. They're out of sync, and it causes so much friction and pain. So the simple question we set ourselves was, can we build a system that brings people into sync about the things they should already be in sync about? And then once you are synchronized, there's lots of other things you can do. You can move quicker, you can reduce costs, pursue opportunities, all the good stuff. But there's no magic at the bottom of it. It's just about making sure that what I see is what you see. That's all we're doing.
Great. Yeah, so the point I made about, everybody's talking about it, and there are so many blockchain evangelists, blockchain experts nowadays who can talk about it. But when it comes to the ground reality, enterprises need the actual skills, people who can develop it. Do you think that scarcity of the skills is actually also one of the factors why it is going slow?
There's probably, I think you're probably right that there is something to that. If you think about, and we worried about this when we designed Corda. So you look at one of the platforms, and it's a very successful platform. Most people dialed into this will know about Ethereum, and Ethereum has an enterprise variant. But one of the things we looked at back in 2015 when we started designing Corda was to use that, you have to learn this programming language called Solidity. Now, it's not that hard. It looks a bit like JavaScript, but it's a new language. New people need to get new skills. And we were asking ourselves back then, we're saying, if this technology is going to change the world, this enterprise blockchain, we don't want hundreds or thousands of people. Literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people have to be able to build these applications. It can't just be sort of like PhD rocket scientists or sort of like back to your example, these sort of like these mystic leaders who everybody else bows down to. The average developer, average people need to be like me. I'm just an average developer. Need to be able to write the programs. So in our case, and again, other people took different decisions. In our case, we said, we need to be able to write these programs in regular languages, Java, Kotlin, that kind of thing, the thing that tens of millions of developers already know. So that's not the only part of it, but skills are hugely important. And of course, the skills build on top of each other because, I think with Corda, we solved the programming model problem, the programming language problem. But these are distributed systems. There's security, there's cryptography, there's an adversarial way of thinking. So you're right. There's a huge amount of skill that people have to have, but there are some things you can do to make it easier, such as using a normal programming language.
Yeah. So Richard Brown is a normal developer. Is a very humble submission from your side. We have to think about our existence now.
Well, that wasn't an exaggeration. I think the reason I was hired by R3 and the value I add is in thinking about the problems we can solve, talking about it, setting strategy, and so forth. But as a developer, I understand computers, I understand code, but I always joke I couldn't get hired into R3 as an engineer. I wouldn't pass our coding test. Although that said, I did notice, you may be aware that GitHub has just taken huge amounts of code and put it into cold storage to protect this code for the future of humanity, to be protected for the next 1,000 years. and Corda is one of the, and I'm sure some other blockchains as well, are one of some of the ones that have been selected. So I now have a tag on GitHub saying I've contributed to this cold storage. But if you look at my contribution to Corda, it's a very small number of lines of code. That's not what my real strength is, I have to admit.
Okay. So, financial industry has been at the forefront of exploring this blockchain technology. R3 also promises us to address the typical needs of BFSI industry. But there are so many other low-hanging fruits in the area of, let's say, digital identity, government services, education, healthcare, and so many others. How do you see the adoption there?
It's been really interesting because you're right. So when we designed, R3 began as a consortium of banks. We built Corda originally for financial services, and it was then the market that told us it was more broadly applicable. We discovered insurers were using it, then an oil and gas firm in Canada, and these other industries started discovering it, and then we realized, and it was a really nice feeling as an engineer because we'd sort of like serendipitously built something that was general purpose. But of course, different industries move at different speeds. But just to take one example, the house buying process in the UK is governed by, or it's managed by a mixture of private sector institutions, solicitors, lawyers, estate agents, and things like that. But also government agencies, the land registry, obviously, that keeps track of the ownership of land. It's a complicated. People don't think of it as a business process, but it is. There's a process you have to go through, from finding a house, securing a mortgage, buying it, registering the title. But it's a business process that is effectively automated by the buyer. It is their job to sort of move paper between these different firms. It's their job to phone up and ask, what's happening? Why hasn't my house been sort of moved forward yet? So there's a startup in the UK, so a private sector. So it's a startup who wants to make money from being successful, that is using, again, Corda, that's how I know about it, using Corda to automate that process. So you've got all these different parties, again, who should be in sync, the lawyers, the bank, the land registry, and they use the software to keep them all in sync without having to change their individual systems. Because if you had to change how every single person worked, nothing would ever change. So that's an example of ultimately driven by the integration with the government land registry, but also lots of private sector institutions. And I think it's just such a nice example of a multi-firm, multi-step, multi-month business process all being brought together. And you can then imagine real benefit when it rolls out for every house buyer in the country.
Great. Yes, definitely. Richard, I was reading one of your blogs, and in that you compared this this interest in DLT technologies to something similar to what happened to the middleware boom in 90s and 2000s. Would you like to elaborate on that, this comparison?
Yeah, it's funny because when I started using the word middleware with some of my colleagues at R3, we have obviously many engineers at the firm, but we also have people from banking and other industries, and some people didn't know what I meant, and I realized that middleware it's not a word that everybody in the world understands. And the parallels to me dated back to my previous role. I worked at IBM for almost 2 decades, 15, 16 years, and in the early 2000s. The big growth, the big growth market, if you like, for enterprise software was this thing called middleware. What IBM and other firms, the big firms, TIBCO, Oracle, Microsoft, those kinds of firms, what they'd realized was firms and companies have spent millions, billions on IT systems over decades, core banking systems, manufacturing systems, all these different applications that all these big firms had installed, and they didn't talk to each other. So there was a realization that we needed software to link together other pieces of software. So it sat in the middle. It sat in the middle, hence middleware. If an order arrived in the customer relationship management system, how do you link that to the manufacturing system and the logistics system? So software like MQ and message brokers and workflow systems, all these new types of middleware emerged, all focused on linking different applications together to make business work better, so that you had all the data inside a firm was synchronized. When different business processes had execute, it was all automated. It drove massive amounts of automation and value. It made so many companies so much more efficient. It wasn't perfect, but it made a big difference. And what I realized was, of course, that it made a huge difference, but it operated at the level of the firm. Individual firms did this to make themselves more efficient. But then when you zoom out and I look at what we're doing with enterprise blockchain, it's kind of the same thing, but at the level of a market. Rather than synchronizing two machines inside a company, it's how do I synchronize two machines in different companies that should be in sync because they both contain the same copy of the purchase order or whatever it might be. So I kind of realized history never repeats. What's that thing that said it echoes? And I realized there's probably a lot of learning, historical learning from the early 2000s that we should use to influence and inspire us now. So that was the point I was trying to make in the blog post.
Interesting. We have one interesting question coming up. I was just waiting for it. It is about, what are your views on, this problem around interoperability? Stopping this, because obviously any new technology, so nobody's sure how long it is going to go. Nobody wants to get stuck with that. If things change tomorrow, they don't want their production data locked in there. So interoperability is obviously going to be one of the challenges that we have to solve for this technology to go mainstream. What do you think about it? How do we solve this problem?
It's a tough one because interoperability has, well, I guess it's a complicated word and it's a complicated subject because there are so many different facets to it. There's things like, okay, well, imagine I've got a Corda network over here. Can it interoperate with a Fabric network here and an Ethereum network here? And sometimes people's histories, it can trap us in faulty thinking. Because of course, if you think about networks, computer networks, I could have had like a Novell network here and a Microsoft network here, and then the internet was this interoperability protocol that linked them all together. So I think lots of people, they made a mistake a few years ago, and they thought there must be an internet protocol for interoperability, something that allows us to link these different blockchains as if they were all just one big network. And you can do that on one level. It's just data moving around. I can communicate with a Fabric node. I can send data to an Ethereum node. But the bar for blockchains is higher. The bar for blockchains is how can we be sure we are in perfect synchronization? And one of the ways we do that is by independently executing common code and checking we get the same answer. One end of it is a Java contract in Corda, and the other end of it is a Solidity contract in Ethereum. The question doesn't even make sense. How could you execute both and get the same answer except through a lot of testing? So long story short is, I think the interoperability question is multifaceted. Like I say, can you invoke services on other blockchains? That's a solved problem. We have things like Corda Settler, Fabric has things you can do that. Can you send data to another network and have it authenticated and digitally signed so you know who it came from and what it means? Yes. But there's one thing that I think people sometimes want, which is I want to have a Fabric node here, an Ethereum node here, and they can just talk to each other as if they're all on the same network. And I think, and I know this is controversial and not everybody agrees with me, but I think that's actually probably not the right answer, because the only way I can see of doing that is by making all the platforms the same. But the reason there are different platforms is because they solve different problems and have different pros and cons. So to get that perfect interoperability, we're actually asking for a single protocol, which therefore means we can't specialize for different use cases. But I could be wrong. It's an empirical question. We'll see where it goes. But we are investing heavily in interoperability, at R3 to make sure different Corda networks can talk to each other, but also that we can talk to other blockchains and to non-blockchains. Interoperability with, obviously, you're an NPCI. Interoperability with existing payment rails is like absolutely critical, for example.
Definitely. So there's one more interesting question coming in, it seems, for me. So Niti Aayog, one of the government organizations here in India, along with a couple of more organizations, are working on how to make this educational certificates fraud-proof. And the participant wants to ask, what are our point of views? So obviously, we talked about this, right? So the digital identity and everything around it, it's something that a common man can feel the tangible benefits of it. So if you give a digital identity and all the services around it to a common man through your government services, they will feel the impact of this technology. Currently, it is being used in enterprises, specifically in the BFSI. So you wouldn't know that in the back end this has changed. But if you put these kind of services, you would see a real difference. You don't need to carry any documentation anywhere. You don't need to prove the authenticity of your educational certificates. You don't need to do the background verifications. So when you go to your employer, everything would be there at a single place, and this service could be offered by the government, so the authenticity is always there. So yes, obviously this is a very great use case, and we need some kind of push coming in from everywhere, not only from the government but also from the private players, to work together and make it a reality. So one more thing, Richard, I wanted to ask. You have been working with so many organizations across the globe, and there are so many different projects. Could you just mention a few highlights in what are happening and how close are they to this production?
Yeah, good to ask. So I've mentioned two European projects. I mentioned the Italian bank reconciliation project, Fronter, the startup in the UK trying to optimize the house buying process. If I look at sort of like more international, a big focus is trade finance and supply chain management. And I think both of those sort of, I wouldn't really call them industries, but those domains, if you like, I think the reason they're have so much focus with projects like the ones my firm works on, Contour and Marco Polo, for example, is that they kind of tick the box. They're so hard to improve because there are so many different firms, buyers, sellers, shippers, banks, ports, all these different organizations in different countries, different jurisdictions, different incentive structures and power structures. The amount of paper that's still associated with trade is I joke sometimes that you could take somebody from 400 years ago, take them into the trade finance desk, the trade finance floor of a bank, and they'd know exactly what was going on. It hasn't changed in 400 years. And yet now, and of course, that's because previous approaches with centralized technology always or necessarily introduced a new participant. There'd be somebody new who's trying to control everything. That changes the power dynamics. It changes the structure of a market. That's really hard. And there's winners and losers, and the losers always fight to make sure it doesn't happen. But if you can implement technology that works with the market, everybody just gets more efficient, or they can do more business. But there are no people unnecessarily lose to the benefit of somebody else. So it works with the grain, which is what decentralized technology like blockchain can achieve. Then you get a win for everybody, and therefore it's so much more likely to happen. So it takes longer, lots of people, international, lots of governments, but the prize is correspondingly higher.
Great. So we have 2 minutes left for this. So I would take this last question, and a viewer wants to know, blockchain is offering so many opportunities, but do we really have the infrastructure and the knowledge to make use of it? So definitely we have. We need to start with something, solve some of the problems, and as we go along the journey, and we want to implement this to everything, the infrastructure and knowledge will also evolve. So it is a process that happens everywhere. It's a natural process, right? We don't need to worry about that part, right?
I agree, and maybe it's not a blockchain comment, but I've been listening during lockdown here in the UK. I've been listening to this amazing BBC World Service podcast about the Apollo moon program. 13. It's called 13 Minutes to the Moon. It's amazing. It goes into huge engineering detail about how they built the Saturn rockets and the lunar module and all the problems and all the rest. But of course, at the heart of that was the Apollo guidance computer. This computer that guided these huge devices. That was 1960s technology with a rope core memory and all that kind of stuff. It did the job, but we look back at it now, and it was so primitive. It worked. It got humanity to the moon, and yet it was so primitive through the rearview mirror. And I guess we're in the same position now. That these early projects are going to have massive impact. But we ain't seen anything yet. Just imagine what it would be like 50 years from now.
Definitely. Okay. So thanks, Richard, for this very insightful session. I would hand it over to Garima for the closing comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boer. Thank you, Mr. Richard. Thank this lovely session, and thank you for joining us today. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our valued partners, National Payments Corporation of India, CrediWatch, PayPoint, and Zendex. I would request everyone to come back in a short while for the next session. And you can visit our exhibition space, which has over 70 exhibitors, and check out some really amazing offerings and win some really exciting prizes. Stay tuned. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.